Hello, my name is Alex Grammatikos, and my paper is entitled Donning Effeminacy to Challenge Imperial Rule, the Gendered Politics of Lord Byron's Sardanapalus. In 2014, the Austrian singer Conchita Wurst took to the stage at the 59th installment of the Eurovision Song Contest in Copenhagen and belted out a James Bond-like ballad entitled Rise Like a Phoenix, a song with which the performer won the entire event. In many ways, the staging was typical for a ballad, with Conchita framed by a spotlight in center stage, the performer throwing up diva-esque hand motions while an air machine blew back her extensions to complement the song's lyrics, such as I'm Gonna Fly and Rise Like a Phoenix. What most viewers would have noticed, indeed what many had commented on in the months leading up to the contest, was that Conchita Wurst, the drag persona of cis male Thomas Neuwirth, donned a beard, and therefore disrupted the clear lines between male and female gender that so many people strictly adhere to. So if you can see here, on the right of the screen is Conchita Wurst winning, that's her Eurovision performance, and then to the left is Tom himself. While many were supportive of Conchita, indeed she won the contest, some were not. For example, in Russia, men began to shave their beards and post their freshly shaven faces with the hashtag prove you're not Conchita. So for example, this is just a stock photo because I didn't want to get in trouble, but for example, men were doing this. And then, with the hashtag. There were many more negative, I would say, anxious reactions to Conchita's Eurovision performance throughout Europe and the world, many of them vile and therefore unnecessary to repeat in this paper. In general, though, commenters were not happy that a bearded woman was being celebrated on the Eurovision stage, with some suggesting that she represented the direction that Europe and the EU were going in, which was in their minds down some sort of corrupt path. All to say, people, and really mostly men, were disturbed by Conchita's gender-bending ways. I start with Conchita and the Eurovision Song Contest because I think her performance and the reactions to it provide context for my discussion of gender performance and state politics in Lord Byron's 1821 play, Sardanapalus. And just to share here, 1827 painting, The Death of Sardanapalus, which kind of gives us a feel for the what was thought of as the hedonistic palatial life of the Assyrian leader Sardanapalus. In his play, Sardanapalus represents the last days of the Assyrian Empire, which is in the process of being overthrown because its ruler, Sardanapalus, has failed to properly govern it. Instead of fighting and expanding his rule, he prefers to host extravagant banquets with the women in his harem. As he tells his brother-in-law Celenmenes, who urges him to take arms for his people, quote, I cannot go on multiplying empires, end quote. For many characters in the play, Sardanapalus' failures as a leader are connected to his effeminacy. Similar to how Conchita was critiqued for blurring gender, Sardanapalus is throughout the play critiqued for being effeminate when he really should be adhering to a more manly role as an imperial ruler. I should note too that Sardanapalus, like Conchita, would have been bearded. For example, in the play's first scene, Sardanapalus' brother-in-law, Celenmenes, laments that the king has allowed his effeminacy to overtake his better judgment. Quote, he must be roused. In his effeminate heart, there is a careless courage which corruption has not all quenched, and latent energies repressed by circumstance, but not destroyed, steeped, but not drowned in deep voluptuousness. Celenmenes also states a couple of lines later that Sardanapalus can, quote, redeem his sloth and shame by only being that which he should be, as easily as the thing he should not be and is. There's a lot of ontology going on here. Were it less toil to sway his nations and consume his life, to head an army than to rule a harem? So as you can see, I've kind of color-coded in blue the kind of more masculine traits, and red the more what Celenmenes believes to be more feminine traits. Finally, to punctuate his position on the emperor, Celenmenes ends his soliloquy and the play's first scene complaining about the, quote, reeking odors of the perfumed trains of Sardanapalus' crew and calling the ruler, quote, as femininely garbed and scarce less female, end quote, than the company he keeps. In his soliloquy, Celenmenes sets out the gendered politics of the play. Sardanapalus' pacifism and partying, coded feminine, are bad for the empire and obscure his true nature, or at least his required calling. Violence and masculinity in service of the empire, or violent masculinity in service of the empire. Characters throughout the play reaffirm Salemenes' position. For example, Arbaces, the man who is to overthrow Sardanapalus, uses the most misogynistic language in the play, calling Sardanapalus a king, less than woman, a silkworm, and the effeminate thing that governs. He even suggests that overthrowing Sardanapalus is degrading for him as he is so effeminate. For his part, the priest Belesius, Arbaces' co-conspirator, adds the epithet she Sardanapalus to the list of insulting names for the leader. Even Sardanapalus' Greek slave girl, Meta, who loves him, states that, quote, she has fallen in my own thoughts by loving this soft stranger, end quote, as women from Greece typically, quote, love none but heroes, end quote. As we can see from these examples, Sardanapalus' gender identity is commented on extensively, and throughout the play, we see a connection between his pacifism, his partying, and his effeminacy. However, Sardanapalus' effeminacy is not merely about other characters thinking he isn't imperial enough. That is, Sardanapalus isn't just deemed effeminate for not wanting to be a warrior, i.e. be a man and fight, but because he actually does behave in ways that culturally Sardanapalus' subjects, not to mention Byron's readers, would have viewed as effeminate. This is an important distinction because Byron is not only making a point about the way that misogynistic language informs imperial attitudes, but is also giving us a male character whose very presence puts others and their belief in imperial rule at unease. Indeed, Sardanapalus' effeminacy is a facet of the king's character that Byron consciously plays up throughout the play. Take, for instance, Byron's stage direction for Sardanapalus' first appearance in the drama in Act 1, Scene 2. Quote, enter Sardanapalus effeminately dressed, his head crowned with flowers, and his robe negligently flowing, attended by a train of women and young slaves. Sardanapalus' effeminacy, I argue, is an identity that informs and complements his pacifist philosophy. Like Conchita Wurst many, many years after him, Sardanapalus puts on a performance that he knows will provoke a reaction. Here, though, I hit upon a point of divergence in critical discourse about Sardanapalus' gender identity. For some critics, like Susan Wolfson, Sardanapalus is innately masculine and merely acting effeminately as a way to reject the dictates of empire, what she calls a, quote, politics of evasion, end quote. Moreover, as Wolfson writes, quote, by placing an effeminate character in a historically specific social configuration, Byron gives himself and his audience a way to think about how deeply judgments about gender are implicated in networks of political and cultural concerns, end quote. Both Byron's writing of and Sardanapalus' acting out of effeminacy is, for Wolfson, a conscious decision that works to scrutinize imperial power. On the other hand, Daniela Garofalo argues that Sardanapalus consciously puts on not effeminacy, but masculinity, as he does in the third act of the play when he gears up for battle, doing so in order to give the semblance of a strong leader and thus a strong state. As Garofalo argues, quote, martial violence is necessary not only for practical reasons of defense, but as an aesthetic event, end quote. Indeed, there is a great phrase that Salemenes uses when describing how a leader can sway his subjects through military display, and that phrase is, quote, pageant power, end quote. When it comes to the debate about Sardanapalus' gender performance, I agree in part both with Wolfson's and Garofalo's formulations, while also reemphasizing that no gender is innate. All gender is, as Judith Butler would argue, performed. The fact that we recognize Sardanapalus as a performer, but not Salemenes, for example, is because, like the characters in the play, we too perhaps have become entrenched in specific cultural configurations of gender, i.e. men act masculine, which means they perform X, while women act feminine, which means they perform Y. Byron, I propose, forces us to recognize both Sardanapalus' effeminacy and masculinity, or at least what we think of as effeminacy and masculinity, as performances. Because being attuned to Sardanapalus' stately performances can help us to recognize how gender aligns with imperial power. Sardanapalus' dual gendered performance comes to the forefront in Act 3, Scene 1. wherein Sardanapalus is finally convinced by Salamenes to take up part in the battle to save his kingdom. As Salamenes' messenger tells Sardanapalus, right, back to the slide, Prince Salamenes doth implore the king to arm himself, although but for a moment, and show himself unto the soldiers. His sole presence in this instance might do more than hosts can do in his behalf. Pania's imploration that Sardanapalus use his pageant power to encourage the army receives full comic treatment from Byron, who has the leader focus on how he'll look on the battlefield. He asks Pania to get him his armor, but not the buckler, for, quote, "'tis too heavy," end quote. He also rejects his helmet for being, quote, "a mountain on my temples," end quote, and instead chooses a diadem, a jewel-encrusted crown that will make him stand out on the battlefield, ignoring his attendant Sphero's warning that the diadem is too conspicuous by proclaiming, quote, "I go forth to be recognized," end quote. Armed with a light cuirass, baldric, sword, and diadem, Sardanapalus is ready for his battlefield entrance, except for one last piece of business. He wants Sphero to bring him a mirror so that he can see how he looks. Gazing at himself in the mirror, Sardanapalus gives this assessment of his outfit. "This cuirass fits me well. The baldric better. And the helm, methinks I seem," and he throws the helmet away, "methinks I seem passing well in these toys. Now to prove them." Here, Sardanapalus demonstrates how masculinity, how gender itself is quite literally put on. Certainly because Sardanapalus is more inclined to pacifism than military action, girding his body with the toys of warfare takes more of an effort than it does for, say, Salamenes. Nonetheless, what Sardanapalus' performance and self-reflection, in this scene demonstrate is that state leadership and military action are performances, perverse costume parties with destructive real-life consequences. It takes an effeminate acting male acting out masculinity in a kind of militaristic drag show to visualize imperial power, as performance, even though that's what it really is, no matter who is doing the acting. So while we might recognize Sardanapalus' performance, we should also recognize, these kinds of performances, whether it's Trump believing himself to be Rambo, or it's Putin riding a bear, which is a photoshopped, performance of masculinity and Putin's state power, right? Right. In the mirror scene, we recognize both Sardanapalus' effeminacy and masculinity as performative, which is important, I'd suggest, because once we recognize the performativity of his state leadership, we can begin to see the utter absurdity of the kind of militaristic masculinist empire that he heads. Moreover, and without misrepresenting Byron as, anarchical or, Marxist, I would say that his drama perhaps demonstrates that we can only begin to dismantle specific kinds of state formations once we understand what gendered attitudes and beliefs feed them. Sardanapalus himself is in the contradictory position of being obliged to maintain an empire while wanting to move away from the kinds of destructive acts or performances that secure its longevity. And the way that tension is played out in the drama is through gender and gender performance. Ultimately, the mirror scene, which is then followed by a battle scene and then a scene where Sardanapalus has a nightmare that he's being attacked by his ancestors, illustrate the precarious nature of Sardanapalus' subject position and gender identity. The requirement to perform masculinity is burdensome, and it is through effeminacy that he seeks to lead, or not to lead, as some characters see it. As he tells Mita early in the play, quote, "I seek but to be loved, not worshipped," end quote. Unfortunately for him, however, his effeminate style of rule doesn't bring the peace he seeks, but discord that ultimately affects the downfall of his empire. But why is that? Can't there be a peaceful empire like Sardanapalus wants? At this juncture, it might be a good question to ask if Sardanapalus' effeminacy can go beyond just being a pose that makes visible the performativity of masculinity and act as an antidote to masculinist imperial statehood. So not only what Sardanapalus' gender identity kind of represents, but what it can maybe actualize. Is Sardanapalus' brand of effeminacy merely Foucauldian discourse, or is there potential for Sardanapalus' gender identity to actually reshape his empire? For Byron, the answer was, or is, no. Sardanapalus' effeminacy cannot affect change in the Assyrian Empire. And why not? I think a simple answer is something I've been discussing all along. Sardanapalus' effeminacy is discordant with the masculinist empire he has inherited. The system would need to be dismantled and reconfigured to accept a peace-loving leader like Sardanapalus, etc. More importantly, though, while Byron's drama revels in Sardanapalus' performativity, it does not ultimately advocate for the Assyrian king or his style of rule. Although he looked to resuscitate Sardanapalus' reputation after Diodorus Siculus' hit job in Bibliotheca Historica, Byron nonetheless believes that leaders like Sardanapalus are perhaps as much an issue as his more masculine acting ancestors, as they gloss over and ignore state violence. He benefits from an exploitative empire despite professing to shun it. Even if Sardanapalus claims that his behavior, what others see as effeminate performance, is noble, his hedonistic palatial lifestyle is built upon the conquering and suffering of others. Much like George IV's Royal Pavilion residence in Brighton. There it is, in the Indo-Saracen style, nonetheless. Sardanapalus, I'll leave it there for a second. Sardanapalus may reject his masculine kingly role, but that doesn't make him an activist for real change. Indeed, as I'll discuss in this last section of my presentation, Sardanapalus in fact helps to sustain the empire's gender norms that promulgate state violence, as evidenced by his misogyny throughout the play. According to gender scholars such as Gail Hawkes, Megan Wright, and Stephen P. Shast, when a man embodies the feminine, there's not truly an appreciation for women or femininity, but instead a celebration of male superiority. As a result, when men enact femininity, they often produce a denigrating and objectifying performance that helps to reify hegemonic masculinity. By acting effeminately, telling his followers that he is made of, quote, a softer clay impregnated with flowers, end quote. Yep, Sardanapalus says that. Sardanapalus tries to inhabit a subject position that links A, masculinity and femininity with violence, and B, effeminacy with peacefulness. Sardanapalus' effeminacy not only helps him to escape masculinity, but to inhabit and reconfigure the feminine for his own selfish purposes. Interestingly, what ultimately frustrates his simplistic political philosophy is women themselves, who disrupt the king's attempts to reimagine gender and state. Although Sardanapalus is viewed as a deviant for acting effeminately, he fails throughout the play to recognize women who deviate from stereotypical female gender roles, because if women can successfully perform masculinity, then Sardanapalus' own performance loses its uniqueness and thus its political edge. In particular, Sardanapalus tries to discount the actions of his grandmother Semiramis, who conquered much of the Middle East and, according to Salamenes, returned to her people, quote, like a man, a hero, end quote. According to Sardanapalus, Semiramis, quote, had better woven within her palace some 20 garments, end quote, than gone to war, as many men died because of her ambition to conquer India. Although he portrays himself as caring about human lives, what Sardanapalus articulates here is his opposition to Semiramis, both for giving in to her natural tendency for violence and for deviating from her expected gender role by taking that violence to the battlefield. Indeed, rather than celebrate Semiramis, who ultimately failed to subjugate India, Sardanapalus honors a different kind of conqueror, the Greek god Dionysus, who he says conquered India through wine. Dionysus is an interesting choice, as he, like Sardanapalus, was sometimes portrayed as an effeminate male adorned by female followers. Here then, we have Sardanapalus replacing female with effeminate accomplishment, and interestingly, equating a woman with state violence and himself with pacifism. Sardanapalus' stately performance depends on restricting women to the roles he believes innate to them, and is thus ultimately oppressive, even if he fails his effeminate pose as pacifist and benevolent, which he does with his Greek slave girl Meta. Throughout the drama, Sardanapalus and Meta have many discussions wherein the king explains to her the errors of her feminine behavior. We might call it mansplaining today. For example, when she counsels him to take up arms in defense of his empire, he tells her that her advice to battle is, quote, too feminine and springs from fear, end quote, and makes this observation about women. I have observed your sex, once roused to wrath, are timidly vindictive to a pitch of perseverance, which I would not copy. I thought you were exempt from this, as from the childish helplessness of Asian women. As he did earlier with his grandmother Semiramis, Sardanapalus aligns female violence with an excess that should be discouraged, as once women are roused, the excessive violence is difficult to contain. For Sardanapalus, state violence is feminine in its excess, and only his brand of knowing effeminacy can act as an antidote to it, a knowing effeminacy that depends on controlling women like Semiramis and Meta. This is why throughout the play, Sardanapalus attempts to wean Meta from her affinity to imperial violence and persuade her that his pacifist philosophy is the ideal. The implication is that while he can see through the performance of state violence, she as a woman, not to mention a slave, does not possess such critical distance. He is in part right. Meta is beholden to a gendered ideology that ultimately results in her being a slave in a foreign land. However, like Sardanapalus, she does understand state performance, as her counseling the king about the importance of the show of war indicates. Indeed, when he goes to battle, she understands the act as a performance. And interestingly, she uses the story of Hercules and Omphale to make this point. And I'll share it very briefly, because I'm running out of time. But here's Hercules wearing Omphale's clothing, though they've done a switch. So the way that Meta conceptualizes it, while Hercules was playing a part in female garb, Sardanapalus is now playing a part in male garb, and Meta's been the one to encourage him to play that part. I'll leave that up for a little bit. The difference between Sardanapalus and Meta is this. While Sardanapalus dislikes imperial violence, Meta understands the importance of the performance, so much so that she voluntarily enters the battlefield herself, like Semiramis before her. And this is just the thing that Sardanapalus is afraid of, being upstaged by a woman. Unsurprisingly, Sardanapalus deploys misogynistic language to explain away Meta's performance, describing it as that, quote, that of the young lion femininely raging and femininely meaneth furiously, because all passions in excess are female, he says, end quote. However, though he might try to explain away Meta's battlefield experience, he ultimately cannot bear how the Greek woman's performance affects his own performance. For his effeminate pose to work, women like Meta must adhere to the gender roles Sardanapalus assigns to them and not become another Semiramis, as his grandmother disrupts his conception of a peaceful empire. After his battlefield experience, Sardanapalus has a troubled sleep wherein he dreams of seeking Meta, but is instead greeted by a gray-haired, withered, bloody-eyed, and bloody-handed, ghostly, ghastly thing, female in garb and crowned upon the brow, sneering with the passion of vengeance, leering too with that of lust, end quote. In short, he encounters his grandmother. He goes on to tell Meta that his grandmother in the dream, quote, burnt my lips up with her noisome kisses, end quote, and implies sexually assaulted him. With her battlefield performance, Meta reminds Sardanapalus of his grandmother, whose violent legacy he cannot escape. Ultimately, Sardanapalus' effeminate political philosophy cannot allow for female agency or performance, which exposes its inefficacy to create real change in the kingdom. Trading one kind of gendered oppression for another is no real solution at all. At the end of the play, Sardanapalus puts on one last performance. He sets up a funeral pyre for himself and Meta that is meant to, quote, to be, quote, a light to lessen ages, rebel nations, and voluptuous princes, end quote. The couple's ashes will be mingled and scattered into the air in a move that Susan Wolfson argues, quote, drives toward a conclusion which effaces the social system that made gender matter. Immediate history with its entanglements of gender and empire is canceled, end quote. For a moment, yes. But in the short term, Arbaces and his crew will come in and take over, and in the long term, the world will establish many more empires, all of which suggests that Sardanapalus' and Meta's fiery lesson about imperial power remains unheeded. Sardanapalus' effeminacy is subversive and disruptive, but it has its limits. While the king's effeminacy might expose stately leadership as performed, this doesn't discount the fact that there are many examples in today's world of state performances that have damaging effects and consequences. Perhaps what makes Sardanapalus' failed performance most important for us now is that it demonstrates how empire shapes and deifies masculinity, and how that deification allows for the perpetuation of various forms of state violence. And so in our discussion on Thursday, Friday, where we all come together, maybe like to discuss how even today citizens of, whether it's state powers or other kinds of nation states, are beholden or obsessed with the ideology of masculinity in terms of state power. And if there is an alternative form of statehood, what might that look like? Thank you for your attention.